The 1960s were a wild time, and looking back, some of the things that were totally normal back then seem absolutely crazy today. The 60s were full of habits that will leave Millennials and Gen Z scratching their heads. From smoking on airplanes to hockey players not wearing helmets, here is a list of shocking things that people did in the 1960s. Nowadays, traveling by air has many rules. You must avoid making phone calls, put your phone on airplane mode, be responsible with your drinking so that you do not get drunk, keep your shoes on, avoid wandering around, use headphones, and especially be mindful of odors. Now, imagine traveling by air, getting drunk, and even do some smoking while at it. It sounds wild, right? That was how life was in the 1960s. In the 60s, the chairs in the airplane had armrests with ashtrays in them. This was a reflection of what the society looked like at that time. People could smoke in hospitals, restaurants, and airplanes. At some point, they stopped people from smoking in their seats, except in some designated areas. Commonly, people were allowed to smoke in the last couple of rows. Turning off the seatbelt sign is a signal for people to smoke. As soon as this happens, you'll see passengers move to the last couple of rows in the plane to light their cigars. This is not the case now. Regulations are tightened on smoking in the airplane. Some consider it too dangerous for smoking to be allowed, as it may lead to blowing up the airplane. To others, the smoke may be a disturbance for other passengers who are not interested in smoking. However, for people who lived in the 1960s, rules such as this are strange to them. Many of them do not even notice that someone beside them is smoking, since it is considered normal. Another act considered normal in the 1960s that will shock most people today is 3 martini lunches. There's a reason the 1960s was considered the Mad Men's era. Most people would think the 2020s are wild, but the 1960s genuinely have a case against that. Working class people commonly go out for lunch and have martinis. Imagine trying to close a deal at noon and you have to drink 4 vodka martinis at a time. That's wild, right? In this world where employees are expected to be sober and be on their best behavior, acts like these are certainly not normal. But in the 1960s, drinking during work hours is considered normal. People made deals over drinks, and in that time, the more you drink, the more the investor is impressed with you. You certainly raise your level to a certain height when you can hold your drink up and still appear in control of yourself. It showed that you could be trusted. One reason for this was that to some people in the 1960s, impression, socializing, and appearance were better metrics for judging people than their performance. That's why it's common to see people stumbling back to the office on a Monday afternoon after taking 3 martinis during their lunch period. It does not have to be a Friday evening to do that. Even when the next day is Tuesday, you can have a few drinks. Speaking of being allowed some shocking acts, many people would be surprised to know that many women straightened their hair with a pressing iron. Arguably, the 1960s sparked the era of bespoke, perfectly tailored suits, dresses, shirts, and pencil trousers. This shows that the fashion trend at the time was incredible. Everything had to be perfect to a T. In this era of varying fashion trends, women's hair was a critical fashion trend. The 1960s was an era of intense hair care. You had to be very mindful and careful about the hairstyle you wore outside, especially when you were attending a high-class occasion. Your hair must reflect class and trend. Achieving this can be time-consuming. Most women had to use a lot of hairspray just to achieve the hairstyle they wanted. Some popular hairstyles at the time could be very tricky. Hairstyles like beehive and beffont required skill and ensuring the hair was prepped to achieve them. That meant the hair needed to be teased, straightened, or curled to achieve them. As a result, people used lots of hairspray just to achieve and maintain their shape. Unlike in recent times when there are different hair products for different hairstyles, women in the 1960s were not so lucky. Moreover, some styles require them to have straightened hair, and some styles require curly hair. That meant people with curly hair had to straighten it out, and those with straight hair had to curl it. Hair straighteners were not a thing in the 1960s. That meant that people had to use clothes irons to straighten their hair. Imagine spreading your hair on an ironing board and someone presses a hot iron on it. Imagine what would happen if the iron is too hot. There goes your hair, right? Well, that was how wild the 1960s were. If you're surprised by this, wait until you hear what children did with their oatmeal in the 1960s. Oatmeal was a common food in the 60s. It's still common today, but it was a staple meal for nearly everyone. However, people needed more. They had to find something to replace, do away with, or get creative. Plain oatmeal was no longer satisfactory, and many people were also getting tired of cream of wheat. Some felt that it was not good enough to satisfy their palates, and children especially thought it needed more sweet substances added to it. So, instead of eating plain oatmeal or wheat cereal, children added a little ice cream to their oatmeal. This satisfied their palates and gave them that little extra sweetness they needed. The oatmeal is still served as the nutritional breakfast it was intended to be. A scoop of ice cream is enough for children to make them happy. Another invention targeted at making children happy in the 1960s, which turned out to be wild, was creepy crawlers. The creepy crawler was simply the toy of the season. It was so popular that it was easily found in every American household. A house without this toy would definitely have its kids bugging them every day to get one. That was how trendy it was. However, it is a wild invention that would never pass today as a good household kids toy. In the 1960s, kids were eager to build or make things from scratch. That is why toys that allowed kids to experiment or build things, such as atomic lab kits and creepy crawlers, were popular. It was also in the 1960s that Legos entered the US market and became widely popular. These points point to the sheer popularity of toys that allow children to build things. The thing about creepy crawlers that would shock most people today is that the makers allowed children to play with hot mini molds. To build things, children would pour liquid plastic into a mini mold, which would heat up and then form any toy of choice. Children could make insects, frogs, and crawling animals. I'm sure people watching now already see the red flags of letting children play with hot mold. The mold could get so hot that kids could get burned. Another problem with this toy was the fumes. Anyone who smells them would have that linger in their memory for a very long time. Also, the liquid plastic was considered dangerous for kids to play with. Children and hot mold are two things that should not be found together. But in the 1960s, it was just like any other normal thing, like allowing kids to play with an actual chemical substance in the name of experimental science. Chemistry sets, such as the Atomic Lab Kit and the Gilbert Chemistry Set, were widely popular in the 1960s. Anyone who wanted their children to have a career in the sciences would get them for their children. The intention was to give them early exposure to the world of science and to help fulfill children's need to make things. However, as the name suggests, these toys can be hazardous. Today, parents would not even consider giving them to their children as playthings. The Atomic Lab Kits were designed to give kids the radioactive materials needed for chemical and nuclear reactions. The Gilbert Chemistry Set contained highly flammable chemicals, such as potassium and ammonium nitrate. To trigger a chain of reactions, kids had to mix dangerous chemicals. Imagine giving your kids radioactive materials and chemicals that could blow up your whole house as just another regular toy. Speaking of chemicals that put the house in danger, using lead for painting was another normal thing in the 1960s. House paints were popular in the 1960s, one way or another. Everyone would have had to use house paint with lead. This is because all the house paints had lead in them at that time. Manufacturers used lead to make house paints because they're durable, dry faster, and resist moisture. However, there was a problem with this. Exposure to lead for a very long time can be very dangerous to one's health. Now, imagine being surrounded by lead all in the name of house painting. This is why, in the late 1970s, the federal government banned manufacturers from using lead in house paints. Interestingly, house paint was not the only product containing lead. Many who lived in the 1960s can testify that lead was easy to find in many things. You could literally go to a store and get a lead bar. You could melt this and use it to make fishing weights. Lead was a vital part of children's toys. Parents would get lead bars for their kids, which they would melt to make any toy of their choice. It's common to see kids with their Soldier Man toys made from melted lead bars. That wasn't the whole story. Children painted these toys made from lead with paints that had lead in them. This overexposure to lead, considered wild, dangerous, and forbidden today, was totally normal back in the 60s. Now, imagine watching a hockey game where players are not wearing protective helmets. Such was sporting life in the 60s. When you tune into your TV to watch a hockey match now, you'll see the players in their protective helmets, protective gloves, shoulder pads, chest protectors, heavily padded shorts, athletic protectors, shin pads, and neck guards. Players in the 60s would find wearing helmets in a hockey game strange. In the 1960s up till the late 1970s, hockey players did not wear protective helmets. It was not until 1979 that the National Hockey League mandated new players to start wearing protective helmets. At that time, old players considered this strange. They considered players wearing helmets too soft. So, the NHL made it optional for old players to wear protective helmets. It was not until 1997 that the last player to play a hockey game without a helmet retired. Now, you shouldn't expect to tune your TV into a hockey game and see a player without a helmet. Well, there you have it, a list of wild things that were considered normal in the 1960s, but would be considered outrageous today. Which of them brings back nostalgic memories? And which do you wish people would make normal again? Let us know in the comments below. And if this trip down memory lane brought back some feelings, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button for more nostalgic content like this one. See you in the next video.